I make a difference between being artistic and being creative. I think that artists are exceptional at channeling creativity, as I like to say, wrestling with the ambiguity of the creative process. But in fact, I think all of us are creative and have a creative capacity and opportunities to build a creative competency. It's just a matter of choosing to do that. Artists choose to do that.
I'm Ranjor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Dr. Natalie Nixon is a creativity strategist, global keynote speaker, and author of the award-winning The Creativity Leap: Unleash Curiosity, Improvisation, and Intuition at Work. As president of Figure 8 Thinking, she advises leaders on transformation by applying wonder and rigor to amplify growth and business value. Natalie's been featured on Forbes, Fast Company, LinkedIn's Hello Monday podcast, and Seth Godin's Akimbo podcast. She lives in Philadelphia with her husband John and is a lifelong student of dance, hip-hop, and social ballroom of late. I spoke to Natalie at the end of January, and I was especially excited to talk to her because she's really one of the most prominent voices who are unapologetically talking about creativity. She talks about how we're all creative and how creativity is a strategic asset in any business. It was so easy to talk to Natalie. It felt like we've known each other for ages, which is how I often feel when I meet a curious and creative person in whatever field. We talked about learning patience and flexibility through her COVID experience, growing up as a sensitive kid in Philly and moving to a rough public school there and how that affected her, how her father's love of jazz and her mother's love of opera and classical music brought her closer to a world of art and creativity. We talked about studying anthropology and Africana studies and how she ended up getting a PhD in design management in London. We talk about the difference between being artistic and being creative. And we talk about why strategy is creative and why creativity is strategic. How we all have a creative capacity, the role of chaos in creativity. Her book, The Creativity Leap, and how dance and design thinking are related, and what she learned about design and creativity from dancing, ballroom dancing, and hip-hop. Talked about embracing difference as a part of the creative process, and how we need people around that will ask different questions than we would. I mean, the talk about dance really stayed with me. I've been thinking about dance as a metaphor for life and for creativity, and Natalie really goes deep there because she's a practitioner of both design, system thinking, and dance on the other hand. This is one of a dozen or so weekly conversations we already have lined up for you with thinkers, designers, makers, authors, entrepreneurs, and investors who are working to change our world for the better. So follow this podcast on your favorite podcast app or head over to remakepod.org to subscribe. And now let's jump right in with Dr. Natalie Nixon. All right. I'm sitting here across the screen from Dr. Natalie Nixon. Natalie, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ron. Nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Usually these days we start with the big COVID question. I'd love to hear how it affected you personally. I know that you're in Philly. How did it affect your work? And anything that you might have learned or anything that surprised you throughout this massive change that we've all been going through?
Yes, and I'm still learning. I think for me, and this is probably for a lot of us, it's taught me flexibility and patience and being adaptive. What's funny is that my second book, my latest book, The Creativity Leap, came out in June 2020. Actually, The pub date was June 21st, 2020. And I remember in late March, I said to my husband, oh, I wonder if I should ask the publisher if we can move the publishing release date to September 2020 when everything will be back to normal.
Right.
I thought, oh, this will be like a blip on the radar. And then I decided to practice a philosophy, which I preach a lot, which I really try to practice, which is that everything happens in the time when it is supposed to happen. And there's nothing that I can do to speed it up. And there's nothing that I can do to slow it down. What's meant for me is meant for me. And I decided, okay, if that was the date, let me just roll with it. Let me just flow with that. And the great news is that because my book came out in June of 2020, I had to really practice a lot of the principles that I preach in the book, which was to collaborate and to ask new and different questions. And so what I ended up doing was I had originally planned to have a book launch party at an iconic structure here in Philadelphia, the Free Library of Philadelphia. It's a beautiful building. It's in the center. It's on the Parkway in Center City. I grew up in Philly. I was a big library kid. I was a nerd. I grew up in libraries. I love libraries. And so it was very symbolic to me to come full circle to have the book launch on the rooftop of the library. And that had to be canceled. And so what I did instead is I reached out to people, some who I've known for years and other people I've known as acquaintances, some people I really admire, and asked them if they would join me in creating a very creative book launch week. And so what I ended up doing on June 21st is I had a breakfast coffee with a really cool, actually Israeli woman named Galit Ariel, who is a expert in augmented reality. And we did morning coffee. I actually interviewed Galit for the book because I was interested in her perspective about the integration of technology and our humanness. And I love her perspective, which is that the opportunity in this fourth industrial revolution is that technology that's taking over tasks will actually make more room for the human to show up. So that was our breakfast chat. And then lunch was with a wonderful woman named Faye Wu. And Faye actually produced my speaker reel. And we've done other projects together. And we had a digital lunch, virtual lunch together. And then evening cocktails were with a friend of mine named King Britt, who's a global DJ. He's now a professor of electronic music at one of the UC, University of California schools. We used to party together a lot when he used to spin at a iconic club in Philly called Silk City. I'm a Gen Xer. I am the hip hop generation and loved house music as well. Growing up, I'm a lifelong dancer. So it was awesome to just reflect on music and culture with King for the evening. And then a few days later, Seth Godin was incredibly generous to invite me on his podcast, Akimbo. We had a conversation about it because Seth is also very interested in promoting creativity. So that was the start of my pandemic chapter of life. And it really was an incredible opportunity to be flexible, collaborate, ask for help in order to keep moving.
Yeah, it feels like a lot of people had this experience where they had to innovate, right? They had to be creative. And of course, it's really tragic for the people affected health-wise and for families and for people losing their job. So it's this weird cognitive dissonance where you see some people in my circle as well who are really suffering and struggling, and then other people who are flourishing. So it's definitely not affecting everyone the same.
No, it's not.
Yeah. So usually we can start this journey into getting to know a guest with this opener question. What's something that you learned in childhood or early in life that still drives you today, that's still very active today?
There's so many things. The thing that popped into my mind as you're asking the question was really to embrace my sensitivity, which is another way of saying to be myself. And I grew up in Philadelphia. I went through 4 very different types of schools by the time I graduated from high school. And I knew about myself from a very young age that I was sensitive in an emotional way, sensitive. I didn't have the language back then, but I think an empath and perceptive. And So I went to a very crunchy granola, hippie, communal, cooperative nursery school. And then I went to urban Philadelphia public school, which was a very different type of environment. And you had to know how to fight. And I wasn't good at fighting. I didn't like to fight. And so I made friends with kids who knew how to fight. They were my buffer. And then after that school, I went to a school in the suburbs of Philadelphia where I was called the N-word for the first couple of weeks of school. I was the first Black child in the class, my sister, and also in her class. And it was my first time of dealing with racism. I was 9 years old. And I had to develop an ability to stand up for myself, to speak up for myself very quickly. And from there, I then ended up going to a Quaker prep high school for the last 6 years of high school, where I was still one of a few. I was an ethnic minority in that school as well. What happened for me, the way I dealt with those experiences was, I won't say that I hardened myself, but there was so much coming at me and so much translation that I was constantly doing, and an awareness that how much my parents were sacrificing for our education, how I didn't want to disappoint, I didn't want to mess up. I knew that when you are one of a few, you tend to stick out a little bit more. And so it wasn't until I would probably say, my late 20s, that I really began to be attuned to the fact that just because I can speak up for myself doesn't mean I always have to. It doesn't mean I always have to in the same way. And that began an embrace of my softer, more sensitive side. And so that softer, sensitive side is something that I realize is an asset now. And it's funny because a lot of the time for women become back in touch with that for a number of different ways. And I really wasn't coming at it from a gender perspective. It was more about just my makeup, my personality, how I am energetically. And it's still funny to this day. My husband comments on this a lot of times when I feel misunderstood. It's because I come across, I'm a confident person. I'm a confident woman. I'm clear. I ask for what I need. And I'm very sensitive. And it's only people who really know me, who I allowed to get to really know me, who really perceive that and understand that about me. Otherwise, people think I'm super confident. I have everything together, which I do not. All these sorts of things. So that is something I draw back from my childhood and that I talk about. I share more, because I realize it's core to who I am. And it's important for all of us to just be ourselves.
Yeah. This seems to be a theme with really creative people, that it comes with a lot of sensitivity and a lot of openness to possibility, to feelings, to how things could be, this idealism. I often feel with my designer friends, where the greatest accomplishment is to be able to maintain that in the face of whatever the world throws at you. So it's a quality I really admire. You talk about your family life, your early family life, as very artistic and there's a lot of creativity there as well. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yes, I reflect a lot about the fact that my mother was a weaver. And a lot of the times in the backseat of the car, my sister and I, instead of playing with dolls, we had our own little lap loom. And we would just be doing a plain weave with a comb and beating it in. My father was a big jazz head. And so he actually learned to play the acoustic upright bass. Right after high school, he entered the Air Force. That was actually his way to move on to college. But it was in the service that he learned to play the bass. My mother actually studied voice. She studied and trained to be an opera singer. So she really loves to this day European classical music. And actually, years later, when my mother was 50, she learned to play the cello. And she still plays, and she's 82 now. So the music theme in my home was huge. And my parents always fostered the artistic sensibility in each of us. My sister is still really gifted in ceramics and pottery. For me, it was dance. And Eran, as you know, I make a difference between being artistic and being creative. I think that artists are exceptional at channeling creativity and, as I like to say, wrestling with the ambiguity of the creative process. But in fact, I think all of us are creative and have a creative capacity and opportunities to build a creative competency. It's just a matter of choosing to do that. Artists choose to do that. And it's not, and I think one of the reasons more of us don't self-identify as creative or maybe are not creative because we're not actually investing the time and space that creativity requires. It's actually hard. Creativity is not like this little whimsical woo-woo muse that strikes some people and doesn't strike others. And then off you go, you get to be creative. No, it actually requires, as I like to say, both wonder and rigor. But in my home, I definitely got the rigor. I got the messages and the opportunities all the time that whatever you decide that you want to focus on and get good at, you have to focus. You have to work at it. You have to have some sacrifice towards honing that craft, whatever your interest is. But I would say in my home, I really grew up very much exposed to the arts. And while we were not wealthy, we certainly had a lovely childhood. It was full of play. It was full of opportunities to use our imagination and opportunities to expand our minds. That was very important to my parents.
Yeah. In your TED Talk, you talk about the love of jazz and everything you learned through jazz. And I'm looking at your journey of first in academia. So if we take a step back, so you started with anthropology and Africana studies, right? And then you study marketing, and then eventually you get a PhD in design management. How does this journey unfolded to get you to that point?
It's a very loopy background. At each juncture, it made complete sense to me. But I will say, before I go through some of those phases, I thrive in multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary spaces. I love not being siloed. And I wasn't always able to admit out loud because I think a lot of us, I certainly did in my early years, through my early 20s, I felt like I had to pick a lane. What is your thing? What are you good at? And there were so many things that I enjoyed and that I was curious about. And so one of the reasons I studied Africana studies and cultural anthropology was because of the opportunity to understand the world from multiple lenses. And I didn't know it then, but studying Africana studies was actually my first introduction to systems design thinking. And I say that because it was a multidisciplinary program where we studied people of the African descent from the lens of philosophy and literature and political science and history. And so it was this opportunity to understand a phenomenon and start to see patterns and connect the dots between different nodes through these different lenses. And it was such an incredible education and skill building for pattern definition and problem solving. And then anthropology taught me how to understand society from the worm's eye view versus what I call the bird's eye view, which I think economics and sociology and political science teach us. And so I leave college. I dabble in several different things. I started a hat design business called Nat's Hats. I was a middle school English teacher. Nat's Hats gave me the bug for business. I realized I loved going from a concept in my head to something tangible in my hands that then I could see people interact with this thing, this object. Yeah. And I decided, gosh, maybe I should do an MBA, maybe I should go right into the fashion industry. And I ended up earning a Master's of Science, as you referenced, in global textile marketing. And that was actually when I lived and studied in Israel. And so part of my master's degree is from Shankar, College of Art and Design. And I had an incredible experience living and studying in Tel Aviv and in Israel, and it was amazing. And then I that same program took me to Germany, to Reutlingen in the south of Germany. After that, I ended up joining a division of the Limited Brands, and I worked in global fashion sourcing. That took me to live and work in Sri Lanka and Portugal, making bras and panties for the Victoria's Secret brand. And then I realized I was tired of being in so dramatically different time zones from family and friends. And I had the opportunity to, and I'm giving you the Cliff Notes version, but I basically through a series of conversations, I got an offer to become an assistant professor at what was then Philadelphia University, now Thomas Jefferson, University. My mentors, when I became a professor, were saying, you should really think about doing a PhD. You're a great professor, you like higher ed, it will give you more options. And I just could not figure out what I would want to invest that amount of time in terms of earning a PhD until I was on my way to London for a totally different reason. And a friend forwarded me an email about some field called design management. And he said, this is totally you. And I was like, I've never heard of this. What is it? I Google it. Turned out it was much bigger in Europe and the UK and Asia. And it turned out there were also doctoral programs in design management. So that's why I ended up doing my PhD in design management. And the beautiful thing about that chapter of my career is that I was working full time, earning my PhD, and my mind was just abuzz. It was just humming. It was just on fire in a good way. It was just really energized because I finally found a discipline that was so multidisciplinary that exposed me to service design and design thinking and much more integrative ways of thinking about business challenges. So it sounds very loopy, but really at every juncture, it was the right time. It made complete sense for me. And the cool thing is that now all of those disparate threads have converged into the work I do now as a creativity strategist. All that skill building has been super helpful to my work now.
Yeah. You ended up starting the strategic design program in Philly, the MBA program. I love the term strategic design. I started using strategic design to explain what I do. So moving on to kind of creativity and innovation, every business knows that innovation is strategic, but they seem to be running away from terms like creativity and design, even though they're the same thing. There's no innovation without design and creativity. Yeah, tell me, how do you see that dynamic in terms of everybody's talking about innovation, but not talking about the underlying thing? And then, is this changing? How are you seeing the process unfolding?
Well, my business card, my byline or my tagline, it says, strategy is creative. Because strategy, in my view, it's fundamentally about our ability to reframe, right? The reason why we need strategy is because we need a fresh, different, distinctive way of thinking about a challenge or an opportunity. And a lot of the time, it doesn't require a 180-degree shift. Sometimes it just requires a 5-degree shift or a 21-degree shift in order to start to see the problem in a new light. So how do we make those shifts? To your point, the underlying catalyst to shifting our point of view is creativity. But the challenge, of course, is that in most corporate environments, creativity is really not understood. People conflate creativity only with the arts. So we'll hear language like, oh, I'm not creative because I can't sing, paint, draw, dance, act, etc., right? Or we'll hear things like, oh, at the end of the strategic planning process, then we'll hand it over to the creatives. The creative department, then they'll take care of it, which is kind of like lipstick on a pig. Those of us who work in design strategy, design thinking, strategic design, we know the very important business case can be made for why design has to be part of strategy and business model innovation from the onset. It should not be tagged on at the end as like a cosmetic sort of thing. So I think that the pandemic actually is going to provide providing an opportunity for a lot more organizations and companies to understand that, especially because of these digital interfaces that have become so frustrating for people, right? How do we really create better teams, collaborate more meaningful, create more impactful solutions for our clients in this very constrained way of working? There's opportunity for companies. They're asking for help of reframing and doing it differently. And integrating creativity is my offering to clients. You and I like talking about systems a lot. And sometimes the way I think about, let's just take curiosity. I think curiosity, inquiry are inputs into a system. Questions are inputs into a system. That system could be a new marketing strategy, a new financial model, a new way to do onboarding, a new type of client opportunity or client engagement. That's the system. And it requires new inputs. The best inputs, in my view, are questions. If we keep asking the same questions when we look at this particular system, we're going to keep getting the same output. How do you get better at asking new questions? One of the ways is to surround yourself with people who don't think like you, who have different training, different experiences, different backgrounds, different gender, different age. They will look at the same challenge and they will think of a question that you would have never thought of, right? Or that you thought was obvious, but the way they phrase it, you're like, actually, that's interesting. That kind of leads us down this other path now. The systems challenges that we have today will be alleviated and improved when we start to build cultures of creativity.
You're listening to Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. If you're listening on a podcast app, you already know how to follow podcasts. So please follow this one. If you're listening in a browser, just go to remakepod.org to find links to all the major podcast players where you can follow our show.
So, in the Creativity Leap, you actually cover a lot of really interesting aspects of creativity in this very rigorous way. You talk about toggling between wonder and rigor as one of the secrets to creativity. Could you explain what that means?
Yes, and I don't mean it to be a secret at all. I just when I wrote The Creativity Leap, the real purpose behind writing the book was to offer a provocation, a way for people and organizations who do not typically think of themselves as creative to actually understand that, according to this definition that I offer, hopefully a simple and accessible definition about creativity, that they actually are incredibly creative. So the way I define creativity, as you just shared, is that creativity is our ability to toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems. And that word toggling is really important. It's not just like staying in the wonder dimension all the time. And certainly not only staying in the rigor dimension, it's having the ability to sense make and know when we need to bring in more wonder in our environment, who we're partnering with, the types of questions we're asking, what we're reading, and when we need to dive into rigor. And if we think about creativity in that way, as our ability to toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems, then we quickly realize that the best engineers, the most amazing accountants, attorneys, teachers, farmers, plumbers, and artists are super creative when they're doing this toggling between wonder and rigor to solve problems. It is the engine for innovation. Without creativity, we really will not ever innovate.
So the way that I connect with this toggling, I try to zoom in really deeply into my own cognitive process when I do it like a design problem. And I've long noticed that there's a period where you listen very carefully and you collect a lot of information and it feels very rigorous and you try to understand the problem from all angles. And then there's a moment of letting go and letting your imagination think, how could this look like? What directions could this take? And it feels very effortless because you let your imagination roam. And then once you have an idea, you once again are rigorous. So is that the kind of opening and closing that you're thinking about? I guess opening and closing is the way that I think of this to myself.
It is. We can think of it as opening and closing. We can think of it as divergent and convergent, diverge, converge. And I am formulating these new ideas. I've been calling it invisible work. And I don't mean invisible work from the feminist perspective, when a lot of feminists who've talked about the invisible work contributions from women that doesn't get credit, that doesn't get accounted for financially, all that sort of thing. The way I'm using this phrase invisible work is to reference, if we think of the Pareto rule, the 80-20 rule, I think 80% of the work that needs to happen is invisible. It's that deep observation, the tinkering with questions. It's making the time to do a brain dump in writing, or to be whatever your work is. Maybe it's in a physical, tangible workshop where you're tinkering with tangible objects. But 80% of the time, it's that input into the process that you can't count the widgets. It's not trackable necessarily. At least we haven't figured out how to track it right now. And that invisible work is essential. And I used to think, oh gosh, maybe I'm procrastinating. Because I just started noticing this pattern of the way I work. There's so much time that has things that have to marinate. I'm picking up things from a commercial I just saw, an interaction between some kids, a headline that just flashed, a conversation I had with my husband over dinner, something our daughter tells us. I start to bring those things in, and then it's whoosh, it converges into 20% of the time when I end up writing it or pushing it out. And there's also research that shows that the 80-20 rule, maybe sometimes it's 70-30, but whether you're talking about a 6-month-long project that a marketing department or product development department team has, or cooking dinner, 70% of the time, it's the prep. It's the thinking about it. It's asking questions. It's prototyping. It's putting different things together. And then it's whoosh. Whoosh is not a very, whoosh is not a very.
Whoosh, it makes sense to me. Whoosh makes sense to me.
Okay, you get whoosh. Yeah. And then whoosh. Okay. It all converges. And I used to resist that. And then I realized that's just the way I work. And I think it's the way a lot of people work. So that invisible work is a lot of the wonder, and it's also a lot of the rigor. The invisible work is not necessarily something that is separated from skill mastery and discipline and focus and time on task. Certainly the convergent part where it all comes together requires a lot of the rigor, but so much of the work happens in that invisible time.
You talk about improvisation. This is a really important principle. And you talk about it in the context of chaotic systems. So systems that are chaotic in some ways, but ordered in some other ways. Help me understand improvisation and chaotic systems and how they tie into creativity.
Yeah, so actually, that's a great segue into another one of the frameworks I developed that I share in the book. So I realized it wasn't enough to say to people, okay, toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems and off you go, you're being creative. How do you operationalize that in a sustained and consistent way? And through something I call the 3 I's. So we've already talked a little bit about inquiry and curiosity when I was talking about how questions are inputs into a system. So one of the I's is inquiry, another of the I's is improvisation, and the third I is intuition. So if we focus though on improvisation is, as you said, it is a chaotic system. And I learned about chaotic systems actually during that chapter of my life when I was earning a PhD while working full-time. I was trying to understand the ways that the Ritz-Carlton Hotel designs experiences that delight its guests. And what I learned from my research is that they actually are an incredibly improvisational organization, which is to say that they are full of fluid structures. So improvisation is not doing whatever you feel like. Improv has rules. So any of us who've learned anything about jazz improvisation, comedic improv, rap artists, there are rules. If you take jazz musicians practice incessantly. They know music theory. Their compositions have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's played in a certain key. There's a chord progression. These are the rules.
Right.
And then you need to know the rules so you can extend and push up against them and distort them a bit. And similarly, what I learned from the Ritz-Carlton, the way they're designed, is that actually the best type of org design are organizations that are designed improvisationally, which is not to say you do away with rules. You need rules, but it's not a permission slip culture. It's not a culture where there's micromanagement. It's a culture where people understand the rules so that they can be adaptive. And what's the definition of improvisation? Improvisational systems are systems that are adaptive, self-organizing, and emergent. So a K-word is a word that D. Hock actually made up. And D. Hock was the first president of Visa, the credit card company. And when he was tasked with being the leader of Visa, he said, how could I make this organization be designed in a way that I observe in nature? Because in nature, I see that there's some chaos, but there's also some order. And it's important to remember that chaos is not anarchy. Chaos is randomness. And order is not control. Order is structure. And he did a mashup of the two words, and he is the one, D. Hock is the one who created this term K-word. It clearly influenced me years later as I was trying to figure out what's a simple way I could define creativity. That wonder rigor piece, right? The wonder is the chaos piece. The rigor is the order piece.
That makes me think of the law of entropy, and Buckminster Fuller talked about syntropy, which is a response to the law of entropy that makes systems create order from the chaos, become orderly as a response to chaos. And that it's clearly one of the organizing principles of everything. It's a fascinating thing that it plays such a big role in human creativity, but also in natural creativity. So I connect this also with dance in a way. So you're very interested in dance, and I'd love to hear the connections you make between dance and systems and creativity.
Totally. Well, the first gift of dance for me in understanding my work is the body as system. And because the body is your instrument, the body is your tool. And the ability, for example, when a dancer stretches her body, it is reverse engineering. When a dancer stretches, a dancer's stretch is really about paying attention to all of the elements, from the feet to the fingers, to the hand, to the neck, to the head, to the core, etc. Then we can take choreography. Choreography is about pattern recognition. And dancers are astute at observing patterns, physical motion patterns outside of themselves, and incorporating them into their own bodies and executing it out in a way that tells a story that's meaningful and comprehensible to other people. But here's the other part of dance that is very meaningful to me, especially as I'm exploring what I call invisible work. Dance has helped me to be embodied in my work, to feel myself. I'm a very kinesthetic learner. I remember in high school, I would have to memorize things. I would be pacing in my room. I would be moving, and I would have to look at things to kind of make connections. And what I've observed is that we are not encouraged to be embodied, to show up embodied in our work. We are encouraged, even rewarded, to show up to our work from the chin up. Sometimes from the heart up, definitely not from the gut up. And I think there's an opportunity now for us to show up to work from the gut up, especially because the more I learned about the third eye, intuition, I learned that we are actually hardwired in our bodies. We have this human antenna called the vagus nerve. It's the longest cranial nerve in our bodies. It goes from the brain down through the heart into our gut. So when we say things like, my gut is telling me, it literally is. Dance training, it integrates mind, body, spirit, your intellect, physical discipline. And I naturally brought that into my work, but found, especially when I worked in more corporate environments, that was not something that was really encouraged. And yet, when I interviewed the 50 plus people for the Creativity Lead, every single one of them, as a successful leader, acknowledged the role of intuition, that nudge in making decisions. So that's the other thing that dance has really gifted me. The latest thing, this is because I started as a modern dancer. As I became a teenager, I studied jazz, hip hop, certainly. And now, much older years later, I'm studying both hip hop and ballroom dance. And ballroom dance is amazing. The biggest thing I've been really interested about what dance is teaching me is the role of following. The woman doesn't have to always be the follower. In a lot of studios, you actually become a better ballroom dancer when you learn to lead as well as follow, because you actually learn like what not to do as a follower that just will drive the leader crazy. But following is an essential part of leadership, I've learned, and that's what ballroom has taught me. The reason following is such an essential part of leadership is because when you're a good follower, you are a good observer, you are good at intuiting, you become better at asking questions, you become better at waiting. And great leaders do that. Great leaders wait to be aligned with their teams. Great leaders listen. Great leaders are really good followers of their teams. And it seems totally counterintuitive because the Western model of leadership in like the top MBA schools is certainty, right? It's about taking control of the helm and plowing ahead.
The heroic leader, dragging everyone along, yeah.
And I don't think that's going to work very well anymore. So that's another thing that dance has taught me.
This is amazing. So I got to dance through religious studies. So I have a master's in religious studies with a focus in Buddhism and Buddhist philosophy, but recently started realizing that a lot of core concepts in religion tied very directly into dance. So I'm working through this book, Dancing, Culture, Religion by Sam Gill. And it's just this overview of all just how all the religions have dance at the very core. And there are several religions of the world that where dance is essentially the main ritual. Like there's very little besides dance, and it's still a religion. And then there's something that you said that really moved me. I heard you say it, I think, on another podcast, but you said the dancers can see movement coming at them from the outside, and then you know how to integrate with it, how to become the movement. And I think that's what we should all be able to do if you take it more metaphorically, to identify something that needs to be done or something that's happening. How do I jump in? How do I become that change?
Thank you for that book. I wrote it down. That's awesome. I'm going to look into that book. Yes, here's what's cool. Right now, boundaries are becoming blurred between work and home, learning and work, learning and home, play, work, play, learning, play, home. We're having to accept that maybe what is the office anymore? What will the office be? And if we're going to invite more of our humanness to show up, we absolutely have the opportunity to treat work as sacred, not just as machine outputs, especially because we as human beings are showing up to it. And we're showing up to it in ways where more personable parts of ourselves are there. You and I, Eran, right now, we have peeks into our home environments through this screen, right? That really matters. That's really necessary. The other part of what you just shared, which I think is very interesting, is the ability for dancers to see what's coming at them and to incorporate it. It's both to anticipate and to incorporate. And I need to study this more. From little that I know, that's an example of proprioception, the ability to be attuned to one's external environment, to be attuned to one's position in space. Dancers are really good at that. Dancers are very attuned and very aware of their position in space and how they're moving through space, and therefore how they are interacting with others moving through space. And that requires a selflessness, that requires collaboration. But again, that's still about being embodied in our work, showing up to the work aware not only of our minds and how we're thinking, but how are we feeling? How are we breathing? What is our gut telling us? How does that then make us more attuned to those around us and sensitive to those around us? These are huge opportunities.
You talk in your book about communing, and community is something that's essential for creativity. Tell me more about that.
Well, creativity is never truly a solo act, in my view, because we are doing mashups of what's come before us. Even when we think we're working alone, we're still borrowing from the past. We're observing the way others do things. I've already shared how, in my view, when we invite others into a problem-solving process, it is enhanced. The former head of design for Nissan car company, Jerry Hirschberg, he created a wonderful term, creative abrasion, where he talked about how every time he had a design challenge, he would invite people from finance and HR and manufacturing and marketing, because he knew that while most people hate collaborating, because they think, oh my God, we could do it so much faster by ourselves. Why do we have to bring in these people? Now we have to explain what we do, we have to learn, et cetera, right? But he understood that friction, that abrasion, can be converted into positive energy. So creativity loves constraints, and creativity loves the stickiness that comes from we brush up against a new way of seeing something. Ultimately, when we invite questions, when we invite ourselves to collaborate with others, we are ceding control. We are ceding control of knowing the answer, of knowing how the outcome is going to be, what the end result is going to be. And that actually makes the process more interesting. I learned so much from other practitioners and scholars who write about creativity, who think about it in sometimes similar ways and sometimes divergent ways. I'm like, oh my gosh, I would have never thought about it that way. That's interesting. That reminds me of blah, 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 right? The communing that happens through connection, through curiosity, through collaboration, only strengthens our own output and process.
Yeah, that definitely resonates with our processes and how you just get so much better outcomes when you have different people with different perspectives. So we have a final closing question. In his TED Talk, the philosopher Alain de Botton talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. And a lecture being the modern day, secular, dry and factual version, and a sermon being a more ancient, a more passionate plea that urgently trying to change someone's life for the better. And he makes the point that we need to have more sermons in the modern world, even in the secular world. And so my question to you is, if you were to give a short sermon for one thing that could really change people's lives for the better, whether in business or in their personal lives, what would that sermon be?
Well, first of all, I'm going to check out Mr. Botton's talk. I really hope that when I speak, that the impact of my speaking is much more like a sermon, because the mission in my work is to change lives with ideas. And the idea that I really more recently want to leave people with is their ability to tap in and to ignite their creative capacity. I think so many people are dying a slow death at work. They don't feel inspired by their work. They're not convinced of the meaning and purpose of their work. And there's that, I don't know if it's an allegory or a story, but there's this little anecdote that someone was visiting NASA and they went to an elevator and they asked, there was another person in the elevator going up and they said, what do you do for NASA? And the person responded, I am building the next spacecraft mission to go to Mars. That's the work that I do at NASA. And then the person got off the elevator and like, wow. And that person was a janitor. And so to be able to have that level, to connect that level of purpose and mission to one's work, because one is exercising wonder and rigor and not afraid to ask questions, following their intuition, being given the permission to improvise and to be experimental. That is the sermon, the impact I want my work to have on people. I want people to be equal parts inspired, as well as be given the practical tactics and skills to begin to later today, tomorrow, a week from now, begin to exercise their creative capacity.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Natalie.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. This was awesome.
All right, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast app or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We run design sprints all over the world, and our goal is to improve outcomes, whether in business or various organizations, through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone. See you next week on Remake.